The wind blew across the dry plains, carrying dust and the faint sound of hooves. The ranch stretched far in every direction. Endless fences, creaking gates, and silence broken only by the calls of crows. The rancher stood outside his wooden house, arms crossed, face roughened by sun and years of work. He had seen workers come and go, but no one ever stayed long. He liked it that way, no chatter, no company, just him and the land. When the new cook arrived, he looked her up and down. She was a heavy-set woman, older than most who'd worked there before, dressed in a plain, faded dress with sleeves too long for the heat. She didn't say much, just nodded when he pointed toward the kitchen. "I'll hire a better cook than you soon enough," he muttered under his breath, not caring if she heard. She didn't flinch. She just walked inside, set down her small bag, and started unpacking like she'd lived there her whole life. By the end of that first day, the house smelled of stew and bread. The rancher, tired from riding, sat at the table and tasted the food. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, simple, warm, filling. He didn't say thank you. He only grunted, stood up, and walked out. The woman kept cleaning as though she hadn't expected gratitude in the first place. Over the next few days, she worked the same way every morning, up before sunrise, moving slowly but never wasting a second. She didn't talk much, but everything around her seemed cleaner, calmer. The rancher noticed, though he'd never admit it. Still, something about her puzzled him. She avoided eye contact, kept to herself, and wore those same long sleeves every single day, even when the sun burned hot enough to make the air shimmer. At night, when the ranch grew quiet, he could hear her humming softly from the kitchen, low and gentle, like a lullaby for herself. There was a stillness about her, a kind of peace that didn't match the tired look in her eyes. He told himself it didn't matter. She was here to cook, nothing more. But somehow, even without speaking, she had already changed the feeling of the ranch, as if something human had moved back in after years of silence. Morning came early on the ranch, long before the first light touched the horizon. The rooster had barely made a sound when the smell of coffee and firewood drifted through the air. The rancher woke up to the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. He pulled on his boots, adjusted his hat, and stepped outside to the cold morning wind. The land was quiet, only the crunch of his steps on the dirt path and the sound of cattle stirring in the distance. When he came back in, the cook was already setting breakfast on the table. She didn't greet him. She didn't need to. The food spoke for her: fresh biscuits, eggs cooked just right, a pot of coffee steaming beside them. The rancher ate in silence while she washed the dishes. Her movements were slow, careful, almost rehearsed. She never turned her back completely, as if she wanted to keep him in sight but couldn't bear to look straight at him. He noticed things, small things, without meaning to. She always kept her sleeves rolled down, even when the heat inside the kitchen turned the air thick. Her hands shook slightly when she lifted the heavy pots, but she never asked for help. Sometimes she'd hum while she worked, soft, low tunes that didn't sound like any song he knew. It wasn't cheerful humming. It sounded more like she was trying to fill the silence so her thoughts wouldn't echo too loud. Days passed that way, quiet, predictable, almost too still. The rancher had grown used to the rhythm of solitude, but this new quiet felt different. Before, silence had been a shield. Now it felt heavy, like it carried something unsaid. He'd find her standing by the window sometimes, staring out at the endless plain with a faraway look. When he spoke, she would flinch ever so slightly, like his voice had pulled her back from another world. One afternoon, while checking the horses, he saw her in the yard hanging laundry. The sun was burning down, yet she wore those long sleeves buttoned to the wrist. Sweat ran down her neck, and still she didn't take them off. He thought about telling her it was foolish to dress like that in this heat, but the words never came out. Something about her posture, the way she stood too straight, too tense, told him that her clothes weren't about comfort. They were armor. Sometimes he'd hear her talking quietly to herself while cooking, just fragments of words, names maybe, or memories. When she realized he was nearby, she'd stop mid-sentence and pretend to focus on her work. He didn't press her. He wasn't the kind of man to ask questions that weren't his business. but he was starting to wonder if, this time, maybe he should. The ranch hands, few as they were, began to notice her too. They joked about the lady cook who never smiled. Some said she was shy. Others said she was strange. The rancher didn't like their talk, though he didn't know why. Maybe because deep down he knew there was nothing funny about her silence. When one of them made a rude comment about her size, the rancher cut him off sharply. The men looked surprised. He wasn't known for defending anyone. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the look on her face when she dropped a plate earlier that day, not angry, not scared, but almost apologetic, like she expected punishment. He had seen that look before, years ago, in the eyes of a stray dog he once rescued, an animal so used to being kicked that it trembled when someone reached to pet it. The next morning, he went out early to mend the fence. When he came back, the smell of bread filled the house again. She was kneading dough, sleeves still buttoned, hair pulled tight. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You work hard," he said simply. She nodded without lifting her eyes. "You don't have to," he added. "There's no one here to impress." For a second her hands stopped moving. Then she gave a small nod and went back to kneading. He noticed her shoulders relax just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the days stretched into weeks, her presence became part of the ranch itself, steady, quiet, reliable. The food was always ready, the rooms kept clean, and somehow, even the animals seemed calmer when she was around. The rancher found himself lingering near the kitchen more often, not for food, but for the peace she carried with her. He began to speak more, testing the silence. Small things about the weather, the cattle, the rising prices in town. She'd respond with short, careful answers. Sometimes a hint of a smile would appear, gone as quickly as it came. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Still, there were moments that unsettled him. Once, when he accidentally dropped a chair too loudly, she jumped back as if struck. Another time, when he raised his hand to point at something on a shelf, she flinched and took a step back before realizing he wasn't reaching for her. The look in her eyes then, fear mixed with shame, stayed with him long after. That night, he couldn't get her face out of his mind. He sat on the porch, watching the sun fade into orange and purple. The land looked peaceful, but the peace inside him was gone. Something was wrong, and he couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. The cook, inside the house, kept moving quietly. She hummed that same broken melody again, trying to drown out whatever memories clawed at her mind. She thought she was safe here, safe enough to work, to exist. But she could still feel the weight of her past on her skin, hidden beneath the sleeves that never came off. Outside, the rancher finally stood up, his jaw set. He didn't know what the truth was, but he knew he couldn't keep ignoring it. The land had taught him to mind his own business. But something about this woman, the quiet strength, the sadness behind her calm, made him break that rule without realizing it. For the first time in years, the silence of the ranch didn't feel like peace. It felt like a secret waiting to be spoken. The next few days passed under the same heavy rhythm, but the air around the ranch began to shift in ways that were hard to name. The rancher noticed it first during supper one night. The cook had brought in a plate of beans and cornbread, but when she set it down, her hand trembled just enough for him to see. He caught a glimpse of her wrist as her sleeve slid up an inch, dark purple marks, half faded, half new. She pulled the fabric down so fast it was as though the world might end if anyone saw. He said nothing, not at first. The words felt stuck somewhere between his throat and his chest. He'd seen bruises before, ranch work was full of them, but not like these. These weren't the rough patches of hard labor. They looked like fingerprints. He forced himself to look away, pretending not to notice, but something in him twisted and wouldn't settle. After she left the room, he sat there in the dim light, staring at his unfinished meal. The food had no taste. Outside, the wind moaned against the walls, and the creak of the old house echoed like a memory he couldn't shake. He had said cruel things before, quick words thrown out of habit, but now they rang differently in his ears. "I'll hire a better cook than you." It had sounded like a joke at the time, a rancher's pride talking. But tonight, those words felt like something uglier. The next morning he rose early, hoping to catch her before she started the fire. He found her already awake, kneeling by the stove, sleeves rolled halfway as she reached for kindling. For a moment he saw the side of her arm again. The skin was pale under the bruises, scattered like old memories. When she realized he was watching, she froze. Then she quickly pulled her sleeve down, murmuring something about needing to get breakfast ready. He wanted to say something, anything, but the right words didn't exist. Instead, he nodded and left, pretending he had chores to do. The truth was, he couldn't bear the look in her eyes. It wasn't fear of him exactly. It was deeper, like a person who'd already learned that fear had no end. Later that day, while fixing a fence, he found his mind wandering back to her. Every sound, the squeak of the gate, the creak of leather, felt tied to that image of her pulling her sleeve down. He kept asking himself questions he didn't want the answers to. Who had hurt her? Was it someone from her past? Or worse, someone who might come looking? That evening, when he came back for supper, she was quieter than usual. She served his meal and turned away quickly. He could see her shoulders stiff, her body small despite her frame. Something inside him, something that had been asleep for years, stirred awake. He wasn't used to caring about anyone. Life on the ranch didn't allow it. But now the thought of her bruises wouldn't leave his head. After dinner, he stepped outside, letting the cool night air hit his face. The sky was endless, a deep ocean of stars. He'd always liked that, the silence, the simplicity of it all. But tonight, even the stars looked colder. Through the open window, he heard her cleaning, humming that same low tune. It wasn't a song for company. It was the kind people sing to themselves when they need to remember they're still here. The days went on, and his unease grew. Every morning he looked for signs, the way she walked, the way she moved her hands. He noticed she winced when lifting heavy pots, like her shoulder hurt. Once, when a ranch hand dropped a sack of grain near her feet, she jumped back so sharply that everyone stopped talking. The hand laughed awkwardly, muttering something about her nerves, but the rancher didn't laugh. He shot the man a look that ended the joke fast. That night he asked her if she was all right. She froze in place, a wooden spoon in her hand. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat, eyes fixed on the floor. He waited, but she said nothing more. There was something about the way she said fine, like a person who'd used that word too many times to believe it. He nodded and left her alone. But when he went to bed, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm, careful, pretending. He thought about how she worked without rest, never asked for anything, never smiled except when she thought no one was looking. It made him wonder what kind of life teaches someone to hide their pain so well. A few days later, he found the truth without meaning to. He was stacking hay in the barn when he heard a sound behind him, a soft whimper, barely there. He followed it and found her near the back wall, struggling to lift a heavy bucket. When she turned, he saw that her face was pale, and there was a fresh bruise on her neck. This one was new, raw, red at the edges. His stomach tightened. He spoke gently. "You hurt yourself." She froze again, the same way as before. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "I'm clumsy." He stepped closer, keeping his voice low. "That's not from falling." She looked at him then, not angry, not scared, but caught. Her eyes were tired, too tired for lying. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "Please don't ask me." He didn't move. The weight of her words hung in the air. The rancher knew then that whatever this was, it didn't start here. It followed her. And maybe, in her mind, it still would. He took a slow breath and stepped back. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "But you don't have to hide either." She didn't answer. She just nodded once and turned away, her hands shaking as she went back to work. The rancher stood there for a while, staring at the ground. He'd thought he understood hardship, drought, loss, loneliness. But this was different. This was pain that didn't show until you were close enough to see the cracks. Outside, the wind rose again, howling through the dry grass. It sounded almost like a voice, a warning, or maybe a reminder. The rancher knew something had changed that day. He could no longer pretend he didn't see. That night, the air over the plains was cold enough to bite. The wind scraped against the windows, and the boards of the old ranch house groaned with every gust. Inside, the only light came from the fire in the kitchen stove. The cook sat close to it, her back hunched, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. Her eyes stared into the flames, unblinking, lost somewhere far beyond them. The rancher stood in the doorway, watching her in silence. He'd spent the last few hours pacing his room, trying to decide whether to say something. The image of the bruise on her neck wouldn't leave him alone. It wasn't right, not on anyone, and it sure didn't belong on someone who worked so hard just to stay invisible. He didn't know what kind of man had left those marks, but he knew the kind. He'd seen men like that before, loud in town, cruel when nobody was looking. Finally, he stepped into the kitchen. His boots made a soft sound on the wooden floor. She didn't look up, but he could tell she knew he was there. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood near the stove, pretending to warm his hands. The silence between them felt heavier than words. "You can't hide pain forever," he said quietly. Her head lifted slightly, eyes flicking toward him before turning away again. "I don't know what you mean," she murmured. Her voice was calm, almost steady, but her hands betrayed her. The mug trembled ever so slightly. He didn't push. "I mean," he said after a pause, "sometimes folks carry things they shouldn't have to. Sometimes they try to cover it up with long sleeves." This time, she froze completely. The only sound was the crackle of firewood. He saw her chest rise, then fall slowly, as if she were deciding whether to breathe or speak. When she finally did, her voice came out small. "You shouldn't ask about that," he nodded. "Maybe not, but I am." She turned then, really turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time since she'd come to the ranch. They weren't angry eyes or scared, they were tired. So tired that even looking at him seemed to cost her something. "I don't want trouble," she said. "I came here to work, that's all." "There's no trouble here," he said. "Not unless someone brings it." For a moment they stood in silence again. Then something inside her seemed to break just a little. She looked down at her arms, at the sleeves she always kept buttoned tight. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," he said softly. The words hung between them like fragile glass. Then slowly she began to talk. Her story came out in pieces, halting, uncertain, as if each word had to fight its way out. She'd been married once years back. A man who drank too much and blamed her for everything wrong in his life. He turned cruel in ways that didn't leave marks at first: words, silence, control. Then one day, it wasn't just words anymore. She tried to leave once, but the world wasn't kind to women on their own, and she had nowhere to go. So she stayed. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire while she spoke, never lifting toward him. She told him how she'd learned to move quietly, to make herself small, to avoid notice. How one night she'd finally run far, far enough that the sound of his voice couldn't reach her anymore. She'd taken a job at a ranch because no one asked questions there. She didn't need kindness, just a place to disappear. When she stopped talking, the room was still. Even the wind outside seemed to have quieted. The rancher stood motionless, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. He'd heard stories like that before, but hearing it from her, seeing the tremble in her fingers, made it real in a way he wasn't ready for. He wanted to say something, but words felt too small. Instead, he moved closer to the stove, set his cup down, and crouched beside her chair. She looked startled, but he kept his voice low and steady. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's gonna hurt you again." Her lips pressed together, trembling. "You can't promise that," she whispered. "I can promise it while you're under this roof," he said. "That's enough for now." For the first time she looked at him, really looked, searching his face for something. Maybe she was trying to see if he meant it. Whatever she found there must have been enough, because her eyes softened, and her shoulders sagged in a way that looked like surrender. Not defeat, relief. She nodded once and turned back to the fire. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. He just sat in the chair across from her, both of them listening to the fire crackle, the sound of the wind fading into the night. Hours seemed to pass like that, two people, strangers bound by something they didn't fully understand. The rancher thought about how easy it had been to dismiss her when she arrived, to joke about finding someone better. Now he felt ashamed of it. This woman wasn't weak. She'd survived more than most men he knew could bear. When the fire finally burned low, she stood, thanked him quietly, and went to her room. He stayed there, staring into the last of the glowing embers, replaying her words over and over. The house felt different now, not just quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding her story. The next morning she was back in the kitchen before dawn, sleeves rolled down, hair pinned neatly. But something had changed in the air. She still moved carefully, still spoke softly, yet the edge of fear was duller. When their eyes met over breakfast, she gave the smallest nod, not gratitude, not apology, but something in between. The rancher nodded back, lifting his coffee cup like a silent promise. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. No one would ever make her feel hunted again, not while he was around. The plains outside stretched wide and open, and for the first time he felt like that openness meant something. A place where maybe both of them could start over, even if they didn't know how. The following days unfolded quietly, but beneath the calm routine, something inside the rancher had shifted. He rose before dawn, as always, but now his first thought wasn't about the cattle or the fences. It was about whether she'd slept, whether she was all right. He told himself it was just responsibility, a man looking after his help. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. When he walked into the kitchen that morning, the smell of fresh bread filled the air. She was already there, her sleeves still rolled down, her movements steady and sure. For the first time, he noticed that her hands didn't tremble as much. There was still a certain quiet sadness around her, but it seemed lighter now, as if she'd set down a small piece of her burden. He sat at the table while she poured his coffee. "You been up long?" he asked. "Since before the sun," she said softly, almost smiling. He nodded, watching her for a moment before saying, "You don't have to work yourself so hard." She glanced at him, the corner of her mouth twitching in something close to amusement. "I don't know how to do anything else," she said. He couldn't help but smile back. It was small, faint, but it was real, the kind of smile that sneaks up on you when you've forgotten how. After breakfast, he went out to mend a gate, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. The ranch had always been a place of solitude, a land too big and too empty for most people to handle. Yet somehow her quiet presence filled it. The kitchen light at dusk, her humming, the smell of bread in the air, it all gave the place something it hadn't had in years. Warmth. Later that afternoon, a few of the ranch hands came by with supplies. They were loud, careless, the way men get when they think the world owes them laughter. One of them, a man named Carter, made a joke about the cook, something about her size, her silence. The words weren't just crude, they carried a mean edge. Before anyone could react, the rancher was in front of him, his voice cold and sharp. "You say something like that again, you'll find work somewhere else." Carter's grin faded. He mumbled an apology and backed off, but the others could see the change in the rancher's eyes. It wasn't just about respect. It was about protection. The kind that comes from seeing someone's pain and deciding, right then and there, that no one else would add to it. That evening, when the rancher came in for dinner, she was unusually quiet. He could tell she'd overheard. Her movements were slower, her eyes softer when she placed the plate in front of him. "You didn't have to do that," she said after a while, not looking up. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "No one deserves that kind of talk." She hesitated, then nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you." He didn't answer, just kept eating, though his appetite had little to do with food. Something about her voice, the way it cracked slightly on the word thank, struck him deeper than he expected. Days turned into weeks and a kind of rhythm formed between them. She began to speak more, telling small stories about her past, nothing too personal, but enough to draw a picture. She'd grown up near the coast, she said once, where the air smelled like salt and the gulls screamed all day. She missed the sound of water. She missed laughing without looking over her shoulder. The rancher listened. He didn't interrupt. He wasn't good with words, but he was good at listening. And sometimes, silence was all a person needed to start healing. One evening, while she was setting the table, she dropped a plate. It shattered across the floor and she froze, her hands shaking. For a split second, fear flashed in her eyes, not fear of the mess, but fear of what might follow. The rancher didn't say a word. He crouched down, picked up the pieces one by one, and threw them away. "It's just a plate," he said quietly. "We've got plenty." Her hands lowered. The tension left her shoulders, and then, something unexpected, she laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real, light and soft, like wind through the tall grass. He looked up at her, surprised, and she covered her mouth with her hand. "I don't even know why I laughed," she said, embarrassed. "Maybe because you can," he said. From that day, something changed. The house no longer felt haunted by silence. There were moments of small joy, a shared joke, a soft tune, the clink of dishes in rhythm with the hum of the fire. She still wore her long sleeves, but sometimes she rolled them up when she cooked, letting the air touch her skin. The rancher never mentioned the scars again. He didn't need to. He started helping her in the kitchen from time to time, though he was clumsy with the utensils. She teased him gently about it, calling him the worst helper west of the river. It was the first time he'd heard her tease anyone. He laughed not at her words but at what they meant: trust. As summer deepened, the ranch came alive. The fields turned golden, the nights warm. On some evenings, they'd sit outside on the porch after dinner, watching the horizon melt into orange and pink. She'd talk about little things, the smell of rain, the sound of the crickets, and he'd listen. His hat tilted low, pretending not to notice how her voice softened in the quiet. One night she looked out at the stars and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How something broken can still find peace." He glanced at her, then back at the sky. "Not strange," he said. "Just takes the right place to mend." She didn't reply, but the faint smile on her face said enough. In the days that followed, she began to hum again, but this time the tune was different, lighter, almost hopeful. The rancher caught himself humming along once, and when she noticed, she laughed softly. "Didn't think you knew how to sing," she said. "I don't," he replied, "but maybe I'm learning." And maybe he was. Because for the first time in a long time, the house didn't just hold work and dust. It held life, quiet, fragile, but alive. And both of them, without saying it out loud, understood that something good was finally taking root between them, something worth protecting. Autumn crept over the plains with soft gold light, and the ranch settled into its quiet rhythm. Mornings began the same: coffee on the stove, fire crackling, the sound of boots across the old wood floor. Yet something about those mornings felt new now. The rancher no longer filled the silence with orders. He lingered by the kitchen doorway, waiting for her soft "good morning" before heading out to the fields. She had changed too, though the change was subtle, like a flower turning toward the sun without anyone noticing. Her laughter, once rare, came easier now. She talked more, mostly about small things, the taste of peaches, the way the clouds looked before rain. And when she smiled, really smiled, it softened the hard edges of the room. The bruises on her arms had faded, but he knew the ones inside took longer. Sometimes he'd find her standing by the porch, gazing out across the land with a kind of peace that seemed new to her. The rancher would stop beside her, neither speaking for a long while. There was no need. They'd learned the power of quiet, the kind that doesn't hide things anymore but makes space for them to heal. One afternoon, a letter arrived from town. The ranch hand brought it, smudged with dust. She took it in her hands, her expression unreadable. He saw her fingers tighten around the paper, saw the way her breath caught for just a second. Later, after supper, he found the unopened letter sitting on the table. "You gonna read it?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, eyes calm but distant. "I don't think I need to," she said. "Some doors don't deserve to be opened again." He nodded. There was a quiet strength in her voice he hadn't heard before. The letter stayed there for a day before she threw it into the fire. The flames caught fast, curling the paper into black ash. She watched it burn without a word, her face steady, her hands still. Life went on, and with each passing week, the ranch began to change in ways neither of them planned. The workers grew more respectful. The laughter around the dinner table lost its cruel edge. Even the animals seemed calmer. The rancher noticed that her cooking had changed too, lighter, warmer, with flavors that lingered. Food made not from habit but from care. One evening, after a long day of herding, he came in to find her sitting by the fire, sewing a torn shirt. The light flickered across her face, and for a moment he saw not the tired woman who had arrived months ago, but someone stronger, steadier. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "You've done more for this place than you know," he said. She looked up, startled. "Me? I just cook." He shook his head. "You made this house a home again." Her lips parted as if to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she looked into her cup, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "It wasn't me," she said quietly. "You just stopped shutting the door." They both smiled at that, a simple truth shared in a flicker of light. As the months rolled by, her laughter became part of the ranch's music, the soft hum between the wind and the creak of the old house. She started going to town sometimes, buying flour and sugar, always coming back before sunset. The rancher worried at first, but she always returned, smiling, saying, "See, I'm still here." Once, when a sudden storm swept through, lightning cracking across the plains, the rancher found her standing in the doorway, watching the rain pour down. Her sleeves were rolled up, her arms bare, her skin catching the glow of the fire behind her. "You should stay away from the door," he said. She laughed softly. "I used to be afraid of thunder," she said. "Not anymore." He stood beside her, watching the rain beat against the earth. It was strange, he thought, how something so fierce could also feel like cleansing. In the weeks that followed, neighbors began stopping by again, people who hadn't visited in years. They noticed the change in him, in the house, in the air itself. "You seem different," one old friend said. The rancher only shrugged. "Guess the place needed some soft around the edges," he replied. The cook stayed by his side through the long season, her presence quiet but constant. She still hummed while she worked, but now the tune had hope in it. Sometimes, when the day ended, she'd sit on the porch with him, a quilt over her lap, watching the stars crawl across the sky. She'd speak of the future, not in big dreams, but in small certainties. "Tomorrow I'll bake a pie," she'd say, "and maybe we'll paint the porch come spring." He'd nod, knowing she wasn't just talking about chores. She was talking about life, about moving forward, one quiet step at a time. The rancher still thought back to the day she'd first arrived, the woman with the heavy silence and the long sleeves. He could still hear his own voice then, rough and thoughtless. "I'll hire a better cook than you." Now, the words felt like they belonged to another man entirely. He had meant them once, but somewhere along the way, that sentence had turned itself inside out. Because, in truth, he hadn't just hired a cook. He'd found a mirror, someone who'd reminded him what it meant to care, to listen, to see the world through softer eyes. And though he would never say it out loud, he knew she had saved him as much as he had saved her. The land, the house, even the air carried their shared silence now, a silence that no longer hid pain but peace. And in that peace, under the wide-open sky, life went quietly on.